Excellent. Well, then I will officially bring everybody together again with another warm and hearty welcome to all of you who are able to join us live, and for all of you who will listen in the future. Thank you so much for joining us as we talk about our Atlanta Gleaning Initiative and the impact that that work has made thus far, and where we hope to bring that work into the near future. I always want to start off our conversations together with a land acknowledgement. And here's a little bit of information about where Food Recovery Network, we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. I happen to live in D.C., and many of the national staff live in and around the D.C. area. So that's Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, collectively known as the DMV. And we sit on the Piscataway Conoy land, of which I pay rent to the Piscataway Conoy. And they are a modern tribe, a modern clan. They are alive today and continue to be stewards of our land, our water, our air. And we wanted to provide thank you to the Piscataway Conoy. And also I wanted to, I know many of you, this might be a first conversation that you've had with FRN. You might be very familiar with the work of FRN. And I wanted to just bring us together, and I'll do that in a couple of different ways. But one of the ways I wanted to bring us together is within the land acknowledgement, and to transition a little bit into the actual substance for today's conversation, is bringing us together to invite all of you to be part of the work. There's a lot that we can all do in many, many different ways. And so I thought it would be nice to read a little bit of Bell Hooks from their book, All About Love, when we think about this invitation to be part of the work. Bell Hooks writes, "But I then talked about the necessity of changing our thinking so that we see ourselves as being like the ones who does change, rather than among the among who refuse to change. What made these individuals exceptional was not that they were any smarter or kinder than their neighbors, but that they were willing to live the truth of their values." So thank you all so much. And including into that thanks, I wanted to thank our lead project funders. We have the EPA, Aramark, Kroger Zero Hunger, Zero Waste Foundation. That all of you made this work possible. And so thank you for your partnership. Thank you for standing with FRN as we've worked to glean food to feed more people faster. And again, to bring us all together into the day's work, FRN, we seek to recover surplus food to feed everyone who is hungry in the United States. This is where we see ourselves. Hunger affects every single zip code. We know that to be true. However, we really want to make it clear that there is a disproportionate amount of hunger that affects our communities of color in the United States. And the next slide goes a bit deeper into what that actually looks like when we think about who is being affected by hunger in the United States. And we will talk more about how FRN seeks to close that gap. So this slide gives us more information about who's experiencing hunger. And we believe at Food Recovery Network that we have a unique contribution to address this issue. And because we can mobilize students all across the country to ensure that our neighbors in need are receiving the food that they deserve. And to learn more about how FRN steeps ourselves in our equity work and more, I'd love to turn things over to Katie Jones.
Hi, everyone. I am Katie Jones. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at FRN. And part of my work here at FRN is to oversee the operations program and communications of the organization. So I'm coming to you today as a person who oversees program here at FRN. And this was my first big project. So I'm really excited to share with you today what we've learned. Before we kind of get into the specifics, I wanted to just ground everyone in the strategic framework and why we do our work. Again, this is a results count framework. It was developed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and they created this framework as a data-driven methodology to close racial and ethnic disparities in communities across the US. So as we think about our programmatic work and how we're data-driven and how we're actually contributing to the result we want to see in the world, this is our framework that allows us to do that. We specifically track the EPA's data around, oh, sorry, Katie, can you go back one slide? We specifically track the EPA's data around how much surplus food exists in the United States. And we also use Feeding America's data for where the most number of people experience hunger. And that will become very important as we talk a little bit later in the deck about why we chose Atlanta and why we're delighted to share in this work. And what you'll see on the framework is also the strategies that we use. Thank you, Katie. The strategies that we use to actually bring this framework to life. And in particular for the Atlanta work, we use strategy 1, which was about creating powerful partnerships, and strategy 2, which was around increasing our impact, specifically in communities where there's large disparities. So the first part of our gleaning work was about the FarmLink project. And this is, again, how we've really brought powerful partnerships to life. And this work would not be made possible, that is made possible because of the FarmLink project. The FarmLink project is a student-run organization who looks to recover surplus food from large commercial farms across the United States. And we partnered with them at the beginning of the pandemic when so many of our campuses were shut down, but so many students were passionate about continuing their work even though they couldn't convene on campus. So we functionally started call banking with the FarmLink project and mobilizing our students to call commercial farms that had experienced massive disruptions in their supply chain because of COVID. And we both identified farms that were willing to have us purchase some of their produce, as well as nonprofits who could take that food. And we are so delighted to continue to engage with FarmLink today, excuse me. And so far from July 2021, we've recovered 1.2 million pounds just through the FarmLink partnership, which is just incredible. What was interesting for us about the FarmLink project was when we actually looked at where that amount of food was being moved, what we were actually seeing was it was going to more affluent states and more affluent areas of affluent states. And that was largely because there were food banks that had full-time staffing. So there was ease in terms of receipt of the produce. They had sufficient refrigeration. They had an infrastructure in terms of like a loading dock and all of these things that you need to actually receive produce in that kind of quantity. And what we said was, well, if we're actually steeped in this framework where we're closing racial and ethnic disparities, then while the FarmLink work is doing a great job at recovering surplus food, which is again one of the indicators that we track, it's actually not helping the 42 million Americans who are food insecure. So that's when we decided we actually wanted to look at the local level and what was some of the work we could do on a local level that would, again, be data-driven, but also help us identify other indicators to help close racial and ethnic disparities. So that's really what led us to Atlanta. And what we did was we used the framework. We looked at where there's the most number of surplus food in the United States, and we overlaid that with the Feeding America data of where there's the most number of people experiencing hunger. And then we overlaid that with where we have FRN chapters that were available to mobilize and actively participate in their community. This is also, again, where the powerful partnerships came in, because we were very lucky to have an existing relationship with the EPA, and some of their staff lived in Atlanta. We also had contacts with the mayor's office of Atlanta. So Atlanta became a very clear place for us to pilot work. to learn about how we can really put our framework into practice. So we designed 3 pilots, which Katie will talk about you in a second. We'll talk to you about in a second. But the guiding question we had when we developed our metrics, when we designed our pilots, when we met with stakeholders, was how can we feed the most number of people with the most need the fastest? And everything really stems from that design question. So with that, I'll actually transition it to Katie A. We go by Katie A and Katie J internally to tell you a little bit about the pilot specifically and then the results.
Thank you, Katie J. So hi, everyone. My name's Katie A, Katie Aguila, and I'm the Special Projects Manager here at FRN. And I've really had the pleasure of being able to lead our gleaning work in Atlanta over the past 1.5 years and have learned so much about, how to do this local gleaning work well, which we will get into a little bit more of really what we learned as we go through the slides. But as Katie mentioned, we developed these 3 different gleaning strategies to pilot in Atlanta to really help us compare and understand what methods would be most effective in reaching our goal to feed the most people the fastest in the communities that have the most need for fresh produce. So I'll give you a little taste of the 3 different pilots that we tested. The first was pilot 1, and in that one, we directly compensated our farmer partners for their produce, as well as we paid them a living wage for their labor and their transportation time. And then in pilot 2, what we did is we identified a whole a variety of local buyers in Atlanta who would then purchase that surplus produce from the farmers at a discount. And then finally in pilot 3, we mobilized FRN's student leaders to glean the produce themselves and then donate that produce to local nonprofits and organizations who could then distribute it into the community. So we really could not have done any of this work without the amazing network of community partners that we built in Atlanta throughout the duration of the project. We worked with a whole variety of stakeholders, including EPA Region 4, which we mentioned, the Atlanta city government, and nonprofit organizations, particularly Second Helpings Atlanta. And we all came together to really ensure that we directed our efforts in Atlanta so that we could be the most impactful. So here I just wanted to highlight 2 of our amazing hunger fighting partners in Atlanta who both received produce through our program, which went to support their particular hunger fighting work and different programs that they have been running for years in Atlanta. And what's also really important that I want to note here is that the whole goal of our local gleaning initiatives is to bring this produce to the opposite of where our FarmLink work was directing produce to. And that's, they're typically going to, as Katie mentioned, the bigger organizations that can take the produce and often the more affluent areas. So what we really focused on here are those small food distribution programs, the local corner stores, the volunteer-run produce pop-up stands, right in the community. These are groups that are smaller. They often lack the funding and infrastructure, and therefore they don't really have the purchasing power that they often need to receive or buy produce from a lot of other programs like this. So when we started this project, we were really hopeful that we could move 10,000 pounds of surplus produce across 3 months. And so we were incredibly delighted and surprised when we actually moved 15,000 pounds of produce in just 3 weeks over summer 2021. So I'll keep diving more into the specific pilots and their outcomes in the coming slides. But the big takeaway that I wanted to just bring here across the entire project is that we really think that there is real promise for local gleaning efforts like this to be able to serve communities with not only access to fresh produce, but access to more resources as a whole. So we identified 5 key metrics that we looked at across the 3 pilots to really understand, to help us understand how successful each of them was in achieving our big goal. And in the next slides, I'll dive into like each of these 5 a little bit more so you can see how they compared across the 3 strategies. So the first outcome we measured is the amount of produce that we actually recovered in each pilot. So we're looking at, of that 15,595 pounds that we moved in total, how much did we move in each of the 3? So there are nuances to pilots 1 and 2 that will, and all 3 really, that we'll uncover as well as we go forward. But what is really striking here, right, is that when we directly compensated farmers at a living wage in pilot 1, we were able to move so much more produce during the project period than in pilots 2 and 3. So the second thing that we measured is not just the amount of produce that we moved, but also how many financial resources we were able to put back into the community in each pilot. You can see really in pilot 1, similar to the first outcome, directly compensating the farmers allowed us to provide financial resources to them that really otherwise they would not have had access to. And in turn, we saw that trickle because that $10,000 our farmer partners then used to pay a living wage to their own employees and keep their small farms running. The third outcome that we measured is how long it actually took to implement each of the pilots. One thing that I'll note here is that the timing that we have here, that 3 weeks, 15 weeks, 3 weeks, represents just the time that we spent executing the pilot once all the partners were confirmed. And I mentioned that because in pilot 1, what we really found is that it took a while to confirm partners because it takes a long time to build a strong relationship with a farmer and ensure that we truly understand their unique needs and how we actually can support them through this work. Once we were able to lay that foundation and really build that relationship with our farmer partners, then we were able to move the produce really quickly in that 3 weeks because we provided enough of a financial incentive to move that produce. At the same time, in pilot 2, we were able to build upon the partnerships that we'd already developed in pilot 1, and we worked with a lot of the same partners in both of those pilots. But pilot 2 took a lot more time to implement because the financial incentives just were not there for the farming partners based on what our local buyers, and again, these are small local markets and businesses, as well as smaller nonprofits and volunteer-run groups, based on what they could actually pay for that produce, even at a discount. Next, we also looked at how much of the food that we moved was actually moved into the communities that had the greatest need for fresh produce. And this is where we can really see how combining FRN's own strategic framework and our own approach to this work with this strong, really key collaboration with our on-the-ground partners allowed us to be really impactful. We had, FRN through our own framework, we'd identified communities with the greatest need as those with food insecurity rates of 20% or higher. But then, working with our partners like the Atlanta Mayor's Office, Department of City Planning, and then Second Helpings Atlanta, we were actually really able to identify exactly where we should direct this fresh produce in Atlanta and get really, really specific on what neighborhoods and communities in Atlanta could best benefit from this fresh produce. And the other thing that I'll just mention here, right, is that these numbers are really good. 90%, 98% is great. But really not surprisingly, pilot 2 is the lower percentage in comparison to pilots 1 and 3, because in pilot 2, we sold produce to the buyers who could afford it. And in some of those cases, those buyers weren't operating in the communities that actually had the highest need. They were operating in the communities that could afford to purchase that produce. And then the last outcome that we looked at is how many stakeholders we engaged in each pilot. And as I mentioned before, but just want to highlight again here, is that we worked with a lot of the same stakeholders across each of the pilots, which I think just really it really shows the strong partnerships that we were able to create across the project, and that really allowed us to lay a strong foundation from pilot to pilot. And then in pilots 1 and 2 in particular, we were really just proud to work with a group of 9 BIPOC owned farms in Georgia. And that's work that we're continuing with them today. And they've just been an amazing partner to work with on this. So finally, I just want to give a snapshot of each of the pilots and the big pros and cons that we identified when analyzing the outcomes that we had during the project period. So there's definitely a lot here. So I just want to pull out a few things, and please, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We would love to just hear what you think and dive into any particular questions or thoughts that you have. But what I'll pull out here from pilot 1 is that, the indicators that we did look at, this shows that pilot 1 fared the best, moved the most produce. At the same time, it is the most expensive pilot to run. And then in pilot 2, we think that, we saw that pilot 2 in really finding local buyers for this surplus produce has a ton of potential to be a really sustainable, long-term model in Atlanta. But it takes a long time to implement. And so it really, it needs more of a runway to be able to build this out and understand exactly how it could work best. And then finally, in pilot 3, when we mobilized our student network to actually engage in the gleanings, quite frankly, what we found was that actually having the students glean the surplus produce from, local farms, community gardens wasn't actually the best way to engage our network. And so something that we are taking to our future gleaning work as we continue our gleaning efforts is to really crack this apple on how to engage our student network in our gleaning efforts in a way that is most meaningful to them and in a way that is most impactful. So with that, I know that was a ton. I will turn it back over to Katie J to just provide a little bit more of a look on what our big key learnings were in Atlanta from our work, as well as show a little bit about what we're up to next in our gleaning work.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. We know that this is very dense, but I'm sure that there's some questions that you have, so please feel free to put them in the chat. So what are our key learnings? What, is our making sense of everything that you've heard today? So the first thing that I'll say is collaboration is key. We could not have done this work without the mayor's office of Atlanta, without the EPA, without 5 veggies. We needed those community partners to actually make this run. And so as we move forward, we are definitely pursuing a variety of strategies to make sure that the community and the community voices are represented in the design and facilitation, because the outcomes we achieved is because of the strength of the partnerships that went into this work. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second, which we've talked a little bit about already, is it really does take significant financial resources to coordinate the needs of all the partners. And that isn't just financial. That's a lot of time about recruitment of partners. That's a lot of time of trust building, relationship building, follow-up one-on-ones. I mean, there were times where we were really threading the needle to make sure everybody's needs were being met. And we found that it was worth it, but we also want to be really transparent that it wasn't like this just got done in 20 weeks. We actually kicked off this work in December of 2020. And so it's a full 18 months later before we could actually present these types of outcomes to you. So one of our biggest takeaways is it needs more runway. So we just want to underscore the resources it takes to run something like this. But we do believe there's so much promise here with this work. And the last takeaway that we thought was really important to mention was, again, just the routine disinvestment that continues in these communities, which in times really provided significant challenges to running the pilot, where so often, you know, we as FRN cannot control if there was a church that was built without current ADA considerations in place, which made delivery of the food difficult. So we think it's important to say, as we continue to work in these prioritized communities, one of the questions we're bringing forward is, again, like, how do we bring resources beyond food to this community, and what are some of the partners that we could involve in that in order to make this work more robust for the community at large? It's one of the reasons that we picked the financial resources back into the community as a lead indicator, because again, like, that's part of the work that we believe needs to happen as we move forward. So I've mentioned moving forward a couple times. What does that actually mean, both in the short term and in the long term? The first is, I'll say, we really did feel like there was a lot of promise, particularly in pilots 1 and 2, where we paid the farmers directly, as well as tried to create a marketplace for the surplus produce. So now FRN is actually continuing our work in Atlanta through May, just to replicate pilots 1 and 2 to see if we get different results, again, as we're at a different stage in the pandemic, as we're looking for different things. So we will continue to be in Atlanta through May, and then our funding concludes in May. So unless that changes, our plan is to actually transition this to a work group of partners after that. We also recognized, as we were going through this, is Atlanta has a certain set of opportunities and challenges that is unique from other places in the country. So we have launched a second pilot in Irvine, California, again, to rerun all 3 strategies and see if we're going to get similar results and do the various outcomes that, again, we'll continue to track across pilots. Is there a different way that engages students that actually drives pilot 3 beyond pilot 1? We're not sure, but that's part of how we are looking to replicate the pilot program in Irvine, and a little bit more about what we're trying to learn this next round. And that will continue at least through December 2022. And really, kind of like the big hope for this work is we can replicate it in multiple communities across the United States. We already have about 25 chapters or so that glean as part of their recovery work. So our next question is already like, you know, we were working with chapters who were interested in gleaning, but not actually gleaning yet. What if we actually went to people who knew the local farmers? How much more could we move then? What would that actually look like? How could the students actually help facilitate the marketplace? So our hope is, after Irvine concludes, that we'll be able to identify a couple more sites. So then we'll have a larger data set to say how we can move more produce to the people of the most need the fastest in kind of a more data informed way. So that's what we're hoping to do for the near term and the long term. So with that, are there any questions? I don't see any in the chat. Okay. And if there are no questions, I guess I can turn it back to Regina to wrap us up.
Wonderful. And please, I know all of us are thinking about what we just learned at different speeds, in different ways. We're connected to the work in different ways. So if questions happen to arise while I'm leading us to our conclusion of our time together, please feel free. We will pause at any time. This is our time together. And that if at any other time you want to be in touch with questions, thoughts, comments, here is our, my information below. And you can feel free to be in touch with us, and we will absolutely make sure that you have those questions, because your questions will help us to do this work better. But also your question is probably very similar to a question that someone else has. At the beginning of our time together, I said, our hope is that we can all see ourselves doing this work, and we can do that work in a variety of different ways. We can do that work together. And so if you're not on our mailing list just yet, please be sure to join the FRN mailing list. We have all kinds of amazing content that comes out, including analysis of our pilots, including blog posts about our work in communities, including invitations, to be part of the work in a variety of ways. So please be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Also, we do have some upcoming conversations that I think might be of interest to many of you listening in. The work that we were talking about today is in large part our bedrock work. People deserve food. Food is a human right. And FRN is going to work all across the country. As I said at the very beginning, we're going to recover surplus food to feed everyone who is hungry in the United States. Food is a right. And the work that Katie have outlined for all of us is part of that. Communities helping one another to ensure that surplus precious food is going into those communities that aren't often getting those phone calls to say, we have a pallet of tomatoes, we have this whole entire truck of cabbage, that might not have the refrigeration to take on 10,000 pounds of food. So Katie A has really forged those relationships that she outlined to all of you today, so that we can authentically understand and be in partnership with these communities that are working so hard already. So that's our bedrock work. People deserve food every single day. And then part of our systems change work, when we think about the number, 42 million people who are food insecure already, FRN is also working to uniquely address that in terms of ensuring the economic security of 42 million people who are food insecure. And we do that in a variety of ways as well. So when Katie J talked about our systems, our framework within our systems change work, we saw that, policy, advocacy, amplifying our voice, these are some of the areas of work. And so upcoming, we do have a couple of conversations that is around that systems change work. How can we advance policy, advocacy to ensure 42 million people are viably whole, so that they can buy the necessities that they need for themselves and for their families. So we'll have a conversation soon in May around one of our policy areas, which is the fight for 15, and that is the fight for $15 minimum wage. And we'll have some information about that. We already do on our blog. So we hope that when you join our newsletter, you'll get the invitation to be part of that conversation around our fight for 15. What is it? Why does it matter? How can it help with that economic security of the 42 million people who are food insecure? We'll also have a conversation around college debt and what that means for thousands of people across the United States, myself included, who do have student debt. We just learned, thanks to our powerful partnership with the National Association of Realtors, that 42% of college debt is on the shoulders of communities of color, of individuals of color. And so we want to learn about student debt, but we also want to learn about what it could look like to offer, as a society, community college that is free, or higher education that is free, or that the tuition to make these advancements that we say as a society that we need, what might that look like, so that the burden isn't so disastrous for any one individual. So we'll have that conversation, and I'm hoping to have that conversation in April, but we'll see. So there's lots of invitations and lots of ways for you to see yourself in the work. And it looks like Katie J has a comment.
We got questions.
How exciting.
A couple of questions, very excited.
I know I had a lot of questions. I am so glad that we have a question. This is great.
All right, you shall I read them?
Oh, please. Yes, I didn't.
Okay, so I will read them, and then this one I'm going to direct to Katie A.
Wonderful.
Were all of the efforts able to be coordinated and managed remotely or from a distance, or did it require some in-person engagement as well? Excellent question.
Yeah, great question. So I did, as FRN Nationals kind of person on the team, we did all of this remotely from not in Atlanta. However, the big caveat is that it only worked because we only could do this work because we had community partners who were on the ground and in person in Atlanta. And so that was, so key to have, members of the EPA, members of the city government, and our own students and alumni and members of our network, and all of and actual, the farmers and growers themselves there, who were kind of guiding us and leading, our efforts and directing us to the right place in Atlanta. Otherwise, we would have just been lost in a sea of where to go, and we would have just been making as educated guesses as we could have to do this work. And by actually partnering with people who were there and having that kind of synergy together, we were then able to really be intentional about what we did and actually get results too, and be able to make, move the food.
And I'll just add to that our Georgia Tech chapter, which was our students that we mobilized for the purpose of this community, did have in-person engagement. They went to glean locally. So while our coordination and management efforts were done remotely, there was in-person engagement, particularly of the students that were in the community when they went to glean.
Absolutely. And Georgia Tech as well as Georgia State University. So that was great.
The second question, have you a vision for what the pilots in a community might grow into? Maybe a permanent organization that is financially sustainable based on earned revenue. So I'll take a swing at this one, and then, Regina or Katie, if you have other thoughts. I don't think we know enough now to know if a permanent organization is actually the way to go. And the reason I say that is I think that we still have a lot of outstanding questions around to whom are we actually serving, and to whom do we actually want to center the work. As Katie A said, Pilot 2 has incredible potential, but we had to, struggle with the fact that the community we were prioritizing didn't have a lot of purchasing power, but that's exactly where we should have been working. And so I think we need to try a few more things and give it a little bit more time before we can determine if it is about another organization that runs this exclusively, if this is an arm of an existing organization, if there's actually an online platform with farmers. I think we need a little bit more information before we can say, which again is why we would love to replicate this in multiple areas of the country if we can. Regina or Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
I do, but Katie A, please, if you have thoughts, I'll go last.
Regina, you can end us. Hi, Tom. Thank you for this question. Tom and I work together on the Atlanta work. So we have, had this conversation a lot of what this could look like. But the one I'll just add that I do think that there is big potential. And again, it's about figuring out, learning more so that we can answer this. But my vision goes to creating a network of the little guys, of those small buyers in a particular community, in this case in Atlanta, that then if we can kind of mobilize and engage them together, then we can, stack that purchasing power to actually allow them to have access to this fresh produce and to these resources. Otherwise, they're just really priced out of, honestly, for a lot of different reasons. And so when when I dream about what this could look like, I dream about, being able to connect all of those small groups that are doing that on the ground work in a way that allows them to really thrive and to support the communities that they're already in. So that's where my vision goes.
It's beautiful. And I want to say yes to both of what Katie and Katie said. When we think about our vision, that, a lot of people are being left out of conversations and are being left out of a lot of work and potential work that's being done. And I will say that those folks that are being left out, it doesn't mean that they aren't working very hard to receive, to try to gain the resources that they need. It doesn't mean that they are not dreaming of, starting their own restaurants and their own businesses. And, it just means that the mainstream isn't listening to them. And, when Katie J said, we need more data and we need more information, that's 100% true. And when Katie A said, we want to help support the folks that are saying over here, that is 100% true. And when I was talking about our framework, that bedrock work of, getting the food people need today, but also then that systems change work, or 42 million people, the number one way people get their food is that they buy it. And so we have to think about at the same time, the work that we're doing in Atlanta is at the same time as hopefully other shifts in policy, in community structures will change, including we have been suppressing the wages of farm folks for centuries at this point. And as we work to course correct that trickle will ensure all kinds of beautiful things that can happen for communities that just simply cannot do that right now. Because, if the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, there is nowhere in this United States that you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment on those wages. There's nowhere. And we think that that is wrong. And we know that when we increase the federal minimum wage up to $15, and we will say, it should be 22 at this point, that means different things for people who are working so hard, working multiple jobs every single day. So for me, yes, we have a vision, and it's at the same time that we expect other systems to start, catching up to support all of us, where there's hunger across the United States.
Great. Then take us out, Regina.
Great. Thank you all again for your time today. Thank you for those questions. Clearly, there's a lot that we want to share with all of you, and please walk away from this conversation, or conclude this conversation with knowing that we really thank you for your support. Thank you for your questions, your curiosity, and know that we see you in this work, and we hope that we can continue the conversation. We will have more updates to all of you. Already things are happening fast and furious in Irvine. It's been really exciting over there. And that's just, a small fraction of the work that we do here at Food Recovery Network. So there's lots of ways to, be involved. And, please let us know if you have any questions. Join us in some of our upcoming conversations. I want to give a huge thank you to Katie and to Katie for structuring this work, for being open to the many flexible moments that needed to happen, for forging these wonderful relationships that we have with our partners on the ground. It's really ensured that we've been able to feed people that maybe wouldn't have gotten those meals otherwise. So thank you so much for all of that. And I do want to say, yes, a huge thank you to Tom for being here. A huge thank you to Tina, who sits on our National Board of Directors. Thank you for your time and commitment, to actually showing up for the conversation today. I hope you all have an amazing day today. I hope you can be in your element and get those things done that you want to get done and feel really good about it while you're doing it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. More soon.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.